Are you ready? Yay! Okay, welcome to my talk. This is one way to survive your first year, or first few years at least. My name is Martin Greip. I am an alumni from Campus Gotland, obviously, and I graduated in 2013. I went to the game design and graphics program. Actually, the last year when it was still Högskolan på Gotland. I do an assortment of things at Eat Create Sleep, which is the company I founded together with my co-founders back in just after school. And my most important job, of course, is as a CEO. But my main passion is art direction and creative direction. So here's 9 easy steps to success. Let's start. So the first one, in this education, you talk a lot about fail often or fail fast or fail better or whatever, which is sort of a mantra in the startup world, especially in Silicon Valley. And honestly, when I was a student, I didn't really think, what does that even mean? How can I systematically put that into, how can I do that for a living? How can you plan to fail? Obviously you don't. So I think what is more important to understand is, if you are ambitious in any way, if you want to make something new, then you will fail a lot. And I think for me, that's when I realized that, the world doesn't work in a way that, some people succeed and some fail. And the real lesson, I read an article yesterday about this mantra and how it needs to die, basically, was the quote. And what the article basically said was that what we need to teach ourselves and others is persistence. So if you have ambitions, then you should realize that you will fail a lot and pick yourself up, glue everything together. And I think that's especially important for people at this education. I went here as well, and I know how I thought as a student, and I think I know how you think. And when I went here, I thought that I should start making a game during the education. I have 3 years, so I can polish one of my games, and when the education is done, I can ship it. And I would ask you to abandon that and see these 3 years as a glorious opportunity to fail a lot. The first year, I made a game for the Gotland Game Conference, which had a core gameplay loop that was broken, which was pointed out to me by a jury member. And the second year, I made an open world game. We actually had something playable for a Gotland Game Conference, but it's completely stupid idea to make as a student team. But all of the glorious failures taught me a lot. And Jakob Roget Berglund, he the first year in 2010 when I began, he said that he wanted to see us fail in an interesting manner rather than succeed in an uninteresting manner. And I think that's what I think sums up. And I think if you want to prepare yourself for the game industry in general, and especially if you want to start a studio, you should have high ambitions and really focus on these years to be prepared to fail. And I think that in the end, set your goal a little bit higher than let's release one of our student projects. Think about who do I want to be in like 10 years? And if you have a bigger goal, then you can set yourself up for more failure and learn to succeed later down the line. Here's a hot take: indie is dead. No, but really, like, you've heard of the indie apocalypse probably, and like there are numbers to support this. Let's go to that one later. So here is some Kickstarter numbers for games. As you can see, it was really popular back in 2012 and especially 2013. And here is when we did a crowdfunding. It was horrible. We actually succeeded, but just barely. And since we had, we were still on this hype cycle when we, as indie devs, we thought that we would succeed this well, but we were fighting for this small amount. And as you can see, it hasn't really, like, we had a short recovery in 2015, but and then if you see on the next slide, like, here is the total amount of projects. And as you can see, like, the median is almost constant, which means that you're basically fighting for a smaller piece of the pie. Let's go back to the fully automated luxury gay space communism. So this was basically my dream when I started. Like, we wanted to create a team and a company that was like everyone owned the means of production equally. And we would be funded by people. We would not have publishers, investors, and people who would get in the way. Like, we would have total control of our business, and we were really obsessed with like the independent ideals of the indie movement. As some of you may know, like, the indie term came from the music industry. Like, an indie band was an unsigned band. So, like, today, like, I would argue that most indies work with a publisher, and like, technically I would argue that then the word has defeated its purpose, because initially indie was a reaction to let's not have a publisher, which it used to have in games as well, but nowadays God knows what indie means. But I think, like, let's not go into an argument of what indie is. It's sort of like deciding what's art. But I think a general idea, and the idea that I had at least, was the degrees of freedom, basically. And I would argue that it's an illusion. Like, you're never free. Like, even if you have, let's say that you're one of the few indies who actually succeed at crowdfunding or early access, or like have some marvelous, sort of like Pixel Ferrets, one of the companies here on Gotland who makes Secrets of Grindja. Like, they've made early access sustainable, but they came in before, like when the door was still open. And like, they are amazing at having a sustainable, but that's like, I don't know, 1%. And I don't think it's, most of us in this room will not be part of the 1%. So one of the things I had to learn was that, this glorious space communism, where we didn't really have to take into account that we live in a capitalist world, like, that's not feasible until the rest of the world has changed with us. So I had to accept that we would have to, like, it's basically a game. It's a permadeath game that we haven't chosen. So just like any game, we explore the possibility space. So what we did was to explore, like, the rules that we couldn't change, and see if there's some leeway in there. And let's get back to that later. Here is the budget of, I haven't really talked about our game because I did that intentionally, because if you want to make a studio, you shouldn't really care about the games you're making. Of course, I don't mean that, but my point is that if you want to build a studio, you have to focus on like an organism that can make more games just than one. So our first commercial product is called Crest, which is a indirect god simulator. And it's a niche product, and it's like, for an indie title, like the budget is fairly big, but it's not unheard of. Like 300 to 600,000 US dollars is not uncommon, and like you will be hard pressed to find this amount on Kickstarter. Like if you're like a high-end team, like if you've worked in AAA for 10 years and probably spent that much money already, maybe you can get that amount from Kickstarter. But yeah, so I'll talk to you how we actually managed to get 6 million Swedish crowns. So if indie is not good, then startups is where it's at. Of course, startup in itself is it's a term steeped in mystery and hype as well as indie. But generally, a startup is a company that is younger than 10 years and hasn't really turned a profit yet. So it means that it's a company that barely scrapes by, basically. And personally, I find that that's a more easy model to work with, because there's not a lot of like, yes, there are romanticism about startups, and there are excellent TV series who like make fun of that, but I think it's like easier to define, because I feel indie is as politicized and theorized as art is today. So a startup, like some would argue that companies like, for example, Twitter could be a startup in one sense, because they're not really profitable yet. But it's still a big business. So that's what's interesting about startups. Of course, most people wouldn't like say that Twitter is a startup, but I just want to mean that like the definitions, they are clearer than indie, but not super clear. But in general, a company who is backed by venture capital and like a young company. So first off, when you start a startup, just as an indie studio, you need a band. And this is also something I've seen a lot of do. And like we were 5 people when we started. And I would advise you not to have many starters or founders, as they say. We were 5, as I said. And today there's only one other co-founder that is still here after 2013. Johannes Häggqvist. He's the Chief Technical Officer, or lead programmer, as we would say. But I think, like, honestly, like, I want to give credit to all of our original co-founders. Like, we would probably not be here today if it weren't for them as well. But in most companies, like especially a limited liability company or aktiebolag, where you own stock, that means that the more, like, if you start at the same time and you have the equal amount of ownership, that means that there will be a lot of chefs running around in that stew. So I would advise to start with a small team, because like good luck agreeing with core values if like you're 5 to 10 people. So I mean, and that's also a reason, because like most student projects you make, like I would guess that you are at least 5 people, and like I would strongly advise that you are like you talk with someone else, like, let's start a company. You figure out who owns stuff. And this isn't like, as I said before, like I still hope for some space communism, but before then we have capitalism and we have companies that someone has to own. Basically, who is responsible? So if you don't like money, you can think of stock ownership as basically like who has a say in the company. Usually the amount of shares you own in a company is tied to like how much power you have. Obviously, I know mostly about how to start a company in Sweden. So if anyone wants to start a company outside of Sweden, then good luck. Find someone else. There are 4 kinds of company structures in Sweden. And as far as I know, 3 and 4 is pretty uncommon in some other countries. But aktiebolag or limited liability companies, like if you want startups, if you want all the money, then you have to start an aktiebolag. Because ekonomisk förening, I think also ekonomisk förening is pretty rare outside of Sweden, so that's why I don't have a translation. But an ekonomisk förening is basically that we were an ekonomisk förening in the beginning. Like basically it's like a membership, so everyone, like no one really owns the shares, like everyone owns the company together, which was like our closest to our glorious future. But if you talk with investors, they get really scared. So we actually had patient investors who believed in us, and they said, come back when you have aktiebolag and we will give you money. So that was basically why we went that route, because, you know, we wanted to eat. And as I said, it's basically about who is responsible. In ekonomisk förening, like everyone is equally responsible, and, you know, that's kind of iffy. And it's also like, if someone leaves, how will they be paid? You can write rules, but it's like much easier with an aktiebolag. Aktiebolag costs 50,000 crowns in Sweden, and I realized that not everyone has that kind of money, especially not after you've been a student. So an ekonomisk förening could be a good start. It's a lot cheaper, and you can actually like transform one kind of company into something else. So that could be like the stage 1 Pokemon or whatever. Next point. Forget Disneyland. My point is that, you know, in Sweden, we basically have 3 cities where like 90% of the game industry is. And that's Stockholm, Malmö, and Göteborg. And as you can see in this Swedish news, and this was just today actually, Goodbye Kansas, which is one of the biggest game investors in Sweden, they are looking towards Norrland. And Avalanche recently started a studio in Malmö, and Paradox also recently started a studio in Malmö. And like the reason is because Stockholm is starting to get saturated, which means that like there are just so many developers and just so much living space. So my tip would be that don't go to Disneyland because it's already full. Or like, or whatever, like whatever capital you want to move to. Like, I think what's glorious with today's internet age is basically that you can hypothetically have a company wherever. We chose to start our company here in Visby, which wasn't like back in 2013. It wasn't as crowded then, and like in Stockholm, I mean. And we didn't really have so much thought around, like I was mostly just, I don't want to live in a big city. that was basically my motivation, which is not a good business decision. As well as like, I want to live in Stockholm. That's not a good business decision. Like, you have to look at, like, let's say, like, if you want venture capital, let's imagine like how many game startups start in Stockholm each year. Let's say 10, 20. And then how many startups start here on Gotland, for example, who stay? That's probably a half per year. So some, like, for example, Almi Invest, which is a state-owned investor and is one of the biggest in Sweden. And they've invested a lot of money into Eat Create Sleep. They have local organizations. For example, this area is Småland and the islands. So let's imagine how many game developers are in Småland and the islands. Well, probably those here on Gotland, and maybe one in Småland, like Växjö or something. So you can realize that they have to invest in each region, and they want to have like the new sexy stuff, which like the game industry is really profitable. So of course Almi wants a game company in their portfolio. So let's imagine like how hard it would be to get that money if you're in Stockholm. And honestly, like, I think, like, I don't know if you can say that you can deserve anything in this society, but I would say that we have worked hard to get the money. But I would imagine that if we would have started the company in Stockholm, we would not have gotten like 2 million Swedish crowns, because then the competition would have been 10 times higher. And like, here is like, what I mean is like, we can go to them and say, hey, we're a game company, and like, just by saying that, we have like a really good sell. I mean, if you do that in Stockholm, that's like, who cares? Though, of course, there are huge setbacks as well. Like, yes, there are, like, studies say that around like up to 90% of investments in Sweden takes place in Stockholm. So maybe I'm contradicting myself. But I mean, with things like Almi, it's much easier to get. And like those 90%, like, investors generally are hesitant in investing in the game industry because it's so volatile and moving so fast. So I would like try to improve my odds. And I mean, it's not impossible to travel to Stockholm from here. Yes, so this is tying back to my earlier point of let's not focus on games. Like, I would actually start with, like, if I made a game, or if I would go back into 2013 and talk with myself, I would like plead to that person that please start with building a company. Because if you build a company and a product at the same time, then you're gonna have a real horrible time. That's usually what happens anyway, because you can't convince investors if you don't have something to show. But we basically spent a year working on our prototype for Crest, and then we thought about starting a company. And I would argue that at least spend like 2-3 months of just figuring out what kind of studio do you want to make. Like, because it's easy, like, if you do your first game, like some studios, like their first game becomes a super hit, sort of like Raft from the students who went here. And I mean, I'm really happy for them. But, and I'm not saying this towards them, but just in general, that if you succeed really well with one game, doesn't mean that the second game, like, it's really common with indie developers who make a first huge hit and the second game bombs. We've seen this. And I mean, it's basically the same in the music industry as well, like what they call the sophomore album, which is the number 2. And for whatever reason, like your second entry usually fails. Like maybe you want to make more creative risks. Maybe your audience just expects one thing from you now. Whatever it is, like if you build your company around one game, you're set up for failure, I would argue. So you should start with like figuring out like who do we want to be. And I don't mean like core values like being a good human, but like do we want to make like free-to-play games, premium? Do we want to say something with our games? Like, are they just for entertainment? Do we want to like, are they serious games? Do we want to make games that's like, I don't know. I hate the term, but like art games. Like, do we want to make games that try to say something? Because if you haven't figured those things out, you cannot really like reproduce. Like you basically have to make an assembly line. Like, can we do this more than once? And if you haven't figured out what kind of company you want to make, then like your first game will be just a lightning in a bottle, which you can never reproduce. So let's just talk quickly about investors. Like when I started, I was really confused about what the hell are, like I had a lot of like the only thing I knew about investors were probably from like bad movies. So let me just give you a quick rundown of an investor. This isn't true of everyone, but I would argue that good investors are sort of like a gambler and an adventurer. A lot of investors are entrepreneurs who have succeeded themselves. So they have sold their company or like earned a lot of money from the company. And a lot of entrepreneurs and investors are driven by like something new. A lot of innovators and adventurers. But usually what an investor does is, let's say, invest in 10 projects at once or 10 companies. Because like statistics say that after the first year, around 90% of startups have gone belly up. And that means that if you're an investor, you know that most of the companies you will invest in will fail. And so they have to have, like, I'm not saying that they are illogical or like addicted like a gambler. I'm just saying that they know they have to take their chances. So the thing is, like, usually an investor wants 10 times the money back. So if they invest 1 million Swedish crowns, they want 10 back. Because they know that, like, let's say that they do that, they spend 1 million on 10 companies. Then only one of those companies need to succeed for the investor to get the money back. And hopefully, like, maybe 2 of those 10 companies will succeed, and then you will actually earn more money. And that's basically how it works. And like, maybe some of you think like, what's the difference between a publisher and an investor? And I would argue that the biggest difference between a publisher and an investor is that an investor has a really long perspective. Like a publisher is probably interested from like the moment you sign to when the game is out and like the DLC is done. But an investor can be with you for 10 years. So I would look at investors as founding members. Like usually you have a board, and the board is basically advisors. So Johannes and I, we are part of this board. And as a CEO, I'm basically responsible to the board. So I report to the board. In this early stage, since I own so much of the company, that means practically that like usually a CEO is a very precarious position who is easily fired. But in this case, since I own so much of the company, I don't feel that threatened. But I'm actually like a CEO is also a position that you don't have like for life. So I'm actually looking for a replacement so I can focus more on the creative side again. But anyway, so when I went into this, I felt like investors just like take control, that I would lose my company. And I read an article of the Stardock publisher CEO just the other day, and he said that it's better to own a piece of something valuable than owning everything of something that is worthless. So I would reflect on this when you're faced with giving control away of your company, because it might be like, will you be here tomorrow, or will your company have gone bankrupt? So I think like when you come to those decisions, that really sobers you, and I think that goes back to the indie thing. Like, you're never free. That's a nice thought, isn't it? And also, when we talk with a lot of investors, I have encountered what I would like to call the Goldilocks Paradox, which is basically like we pitch to one investor and they say, why don't you have a 5-year plan? We want you to have a 5-year plan. And then we go and make a 5-year plan with like, yeah, when we're done with this game, we will release this game, etc. And the next investor comes up and say to me, why do you have a 5-year plan? You should just focus on one game. And this is actual conversations I've had. And the third one is like, why are you making a premium game? Like, free to play is where it's at, and etc. etc. I once got advice from an investor who actually didn't know anything about games to make a free to play game. Like, in the first sentence he said, I know nothing about games, but in the second sentence he said, but you should make a free to play game. But that makes our job easy. There's a lot of talented and super smart investors and entrepreneurs. So I'm not trying to, like, it's just as humanity in general, like, it's varied and multifaceted. But my point with this is that, as the saying goes, regardless where you point your ass, you will always turn it to someone. Like you can never satisfy everyone, and especially like if you're in this precarious situation where you actually need to convince someone to be able to pay rent, like, then you're really eager to change things. But I would advise you to start to think for yourself. And you may think, well, of course, I do that all the time. But like, when you're starving, that becomes really okay, not literally starving, but when you're faced with like having no money for the company, then like you start to forget why you started the company. And the thing is, like, Peter Thiel, I'm going to share a lot of ideas with him otherwise, but I think he wrote a really good book called From Zero to One. And he said that a startup is basically a cult but compared to a cult, where everyone is dead wrong about something, a startup is a cult that is completely right about something. It's just that the rest of the world hasn't figured out yet. So with that in mind, I would ask you to like remember that regardless of what you're like, regardless if you say that you're a free to play company, if if you make premium, if you make pretentious games, if you don't like one time I pitched at Eat Create Sleep we say that we make games where we ask tough questions and let the players explore the answers. And one veteran in the game industry said he scoffed and he said, "That sounds like a Greenpeace pamphlet. Where's the fun? Is that? Where is the fun in that?" So that was obviously a not no sell, but like that person didn't make that kind of games, and like just move on. Like you can't convince everyone. Everyone has their idea of what games should be, and like there's a lot of trends as well, and that's what I say. Like for a while, every investor talked about free to play. And then for a while they talked about VR and then blockchains and so I would like, for example, when we started, like God games and management games are obviously a niche genre, and like Eat Create Sleep is not a one-trick pony. Like our next game is not Crest 2. But in 2013, like management games was really dead. And like just the last year or two, like we've seen a lot of management games sell really well. I mean, when I started in 2013, and someone would say that a spiritual successor to Theme Hospital would be published by Sega, I would think that would sound ridiculous. But here we are, and management games, like right now, management games has a small trend, I guess. But you can't predict this stuff. So like that's why, you know, when people make battle royale ripoffs, like we laugh at that, but like remember that it's really easy. Like everyone is really like it's really easy to fall for the hype. But the thing is, like when you have acknowledged that there is a trend, like then it's already too late. Like it's sort of like the crowdfunding thing I showed you. Like we saw that in 2013, crowdfunding was really well, and then when we jumped on the train, it was already too late for us. Of course, that was not the only reason, but probably one of them. So, well, you are frustrated with people not like buying your vision. Like, yes, you should listen to feedback, but you have to like parse it, because you will probably hear contradicting. Like as I said, the first investor we said do this, and when you iterate, the second investor will say that you did wrong. So you should look at your values and find investors and partners, publishers as well, who share your ideals. Because like I would argue that regardless of what you want to do, like I think you would be hard pressed to not find someone who shares your ideals. And here is like maybe a point that is more focused on those of you who want to be some kind of manager or leader. Like in the beginning, like when you make a startup, like everyone is basically owning the company together. So there's a whole other power dynamic. But let's imagine that you one day will have employees. At Eat Create Sleep, right now we are 10 people. And Johannes and I, we are obviously employed as well, but we own the company as well. So there are, and one intern, but we have 7 employees. And the power dynamics between those who own a company and those who are only employed, like that has to be acknowledged. And that is especially important, that the leaders, and like I don't know how many here who want to start a company, but if you do, you should really take a good look at yourself and not be a horrible person. And it might be harder than you think. Like just like this poor old king was crazy. Like personally, I had a talk last year about mental health issues, and I think there's a lot of people in the game industry who suffer mental health issues. Like I think in our company, I think there's like half of the company have ongoing mental health issues or have had it at least. And according to, like, I saw a talk about mental health issues in the game industry, and the psychologist said that like a fourth of every person on Earth will face mental health issues during their lifetime. And there's also, like, you know, the old saying that to make great art you have to suffer. And as I argued last year, and just like articles and studies have shown, that there is no clear correlation about the suffering creating great art, but rather than a lot of people who suffer like go to the creative fields because like creativity is one of the only ways for them to feel better. So when I started, like, I've suffered general anxiety and social anxiety. So when I started 5 years back, I was probably as kooky as this king. But I haven't eaten pea soup yet, at least, so I'm still living. But like what I realized, like when we started, I was kind of jumpy and like paranoid, and those are not great leading characteristics. So like I've actually, you know, I feel that like a CEO or a leader or a manager has to be extra important with like managing their mental health, because if you're unwell, it's really easy to lash out, and you also set like the tone of the company. So I would argue that like a manager has to be like a better person than everyone else. Like, yes, one of your employees is insufferable sometimes, but like I would argue that a manager has to be better than humanity in general, because you really set the tone for the whole company. In my case, therapy really helped, and then this guy as well. He's called Luke. He's a Gotland rabbit, actually. It's a land race. It's actually Sweden's land race, rabbit race. But the last ones were found here on Gotland. Like they thought the land race rabbit in Sweden had gone extinct, but they found in the 70s, they found a few farms on Gotland that still had this breed. So that's actually why it's called the Gotland rabbit. And he's from Gotland as well. But, you know, I can go on, talk about Loki all day, and that's kind of my point. He's basically, he means a lot to me, but he's not he's not really important for the company. And I would argue, like, I mean, I can't say to you like how you can get well, but for me, therapy and a rabbit really helped. And I think like getting something like friends, like I think when you start a company, you get really obsessed about the company, and like you really need to still continue have a functional life outside of that, because like especially if you have mental health issues, you should like be really keen on that. And I think it's, I don't want to like, I think a company is not built by the founders but everyone, and I think, you know, there's a lot of like author worship and everything, but you know, if you start seeing like there's a common thread in a lot of entrepreneurs and founders who are a bit kooky, and I think, like as I said earlier, I don't think you have to suffer. I don't think you have to have a shitty childhood or whatever to have imagination. But I think it's like common that we, like, those who suffer a lot drift to creativity. And I think if you find yourself as someone who's a bit screwed and actually a leader, then like please get help, because like then it's not only you who suffer. And lastly, I want to close with this old quote by supposedly Heraclitus, who was an old Greek philosopher, who said that the only constant is change. And my point with that is that everything I've said in this talk is already outdated. So you shouldn't listen to it. No, I'm kidding. But what I mean is, like, if I listen to advice from 5 years ago, like, if someone would say, like the jury is still out, but you know, most of you have probably followed the news that Epic will open, or has already opened, the Epic Steam store, or Epic Store, who could potentially be a competitor to Steam. And like right now, probably everyone is skeptic because, you know, all of the others, like GOG does okay, but like there's no real competitors. But I mean, let's imagine in 5 years, like, who has any idea? Like maybe Epic has bought Steam in 5 years. No idea. Like let's go back to 2013 and like just think about how the game landscape. Like back then, no one talked about in the apocalypse, for example. Now everyone does. So I would. And I think it's a great saying, and it was actually repurposed for the famous Dune universe, where Frank Herbert actually wrote the only constant in the universe is change, which is also like a key point of the whole Dune mythos, that like everything is constantly changing. So you should never stop learning. Like I obviously learn every day still. And like and as I said with the Goldilocks thing, like this is my story, because I can't really talk about the story I can't own. Like then I would just talk bullshit. Like I have to ground it in something I know. So like if you feel that one of these points, like if you feel like screw you, I want to move to Stockholm, I want to make a free-to-play VR game, then like have fun. Like maybe you will succeed. Like maybe you want to make a free to play on early access. I don't know. Like it's up to you. And as I said in point 7 as well, the Goldilocks thing. That in the end, it's down to you. Like what is your values, and if some of these points contradicts your values, then you have to think about why do I ignore this advice? That's basically it. All right, thank you. And as you can see, I only linked to my LinkedIn because I think if you want to start a business, you have to be there. No, but seriously, like it's great for like before when I was a student, I was like, I don't want to use LinkedIn, but it's really good, just like cold handshakes and stuff. So yeah, feel free to add me there if you have more questions. So okay, so now we basically have 11 minutes and 10 seconds for Q&A. So please ask me things. Yes.
Did Almi bring in any investors that had earlier game experience or of the gaming industry that you find useful?
Almi Invest, our fund manager, as they're called, is not really knowledgeable. Like they have invested in game companies before, but they don't know a lot about games. And I wouldn't say that this is true for all. Like Tarja, who is our contact that's at Almi, she's awesome. And like basically, like usually the founders are those who knows the most about the product you're making. So usually, like you should, like that's not a problem, I would say. Like she has full respect in that when we say this is good for our product, she respects that. What she knows is how to run a business and how to run a company. So, you know, like I didn't get an education how to understand how shares work, or like how to run a company, and she knows that. Like we want to have a new CEO. How do we do that? Like she have the answers. So usually you have a board, as I said, board of directors, and we have some investors who actually are. We have one guy who is heavily involved in Fat Shark, for example. So he has a lot of previous experience with game companies, and he has like. So in our meetings, like we have all of these different perspectives. So I would say that all of your investors doesn't have to have like preferably you would want to collect we have one investor who knows game hardware, we have one investor who knows game software, and we have one investor who knows like everything about running a company, and then our chairman, he's basically done everything. So yeah, so see, I wouldn't say that Almi, like if you want to encourage like if you want to convince Almi, it's more important to talk about like the company values and like your idea for the company. So like of course they want to see a product, but that will like if an investor is very like game focused, they will probably almost be like a publisher, like in their way they evaluate you. But other investors will probably like look at your company in a more general way. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, 8 minutes.
I'm wondering, do you know how investor would look at a company with a lot of CEOs? For example, if you had a company with maybe 8 of them, how would the investor respond to that?
Honestly, like I don't want to like. I don't want to say like there's only one way, but like if you mean like shareholders, like if you're 8 founders, basically.
Yeah.
Like I talked, like that's maybe like the Goldilocks thing again, but I talked with a game investor just a few weeks before, and the person said, "Yeah, you seem okay, but you're too many." And we are 2 founders and 7 employees. So that person would probably think that you're too many, because like nowadays they talk about a lot of startups that basically you do, like most of you probably went to the earlier talk with Valiant, and like they are 3 core people, and then they have a lot of contractors, and that's usually how some investors want you to do it. Like you have a small team, and then you have a lot of contractors. So like some investors would probably say you're too many, but then again, like maybe you need that many from the start. Like personally, I think that having mostly contractors is like, I don't really like the gig economy for ideological purposes. Like I would prefer to have people as employees, because that's like, I think your life as a employee is better if you have some safety, but like that's not like a business argument. So yeah, so I honestly don't know, but if you can find an argument that 8 people is needed, then you should go with that. I actually talked with on Reddit once with the people who made Octodad, and they were 16 when they made the prototype. And I asked them, like, I think it was like a Ask Me Anything thread, and I asked them like, how did you, because they were basically 8 when they made the game, and I was like, how did you manage that? And they said, oh, we gave 1% royalties to each. Like 8 people stayed and 8 had to go, so they gave 1% of like the sales to each of them, which like if a game sells a few 100,000 copies, that would be a lot of money for a student project. So that's how they did it. But But yeah, like the reason usually why you don't want a big team is like a term called burn rate, which is basically how much you spend each month, which like you can understand that as like a private citizen as well. So like with 8 people, like for example, Eat Great Sleep has like a burn rate of 300,000 per month. And let's just say that you have like money, like sort of like student loans or something, like 10, 15 per month. Like even then for 8 people, that would be maybe like 150 or 200,000 per month. And that would mean that you would need like a huge amount of money from the get-go. And as I said, like you will all fail a lot. So the investor might be hesitant that this money might run out before you've figured out how to make a profitable business. Though, like honestly, like try. Because I don't want to. I just want to give advice. I don't want to shoot you down. Good luck.
Yeah, one more thing, because we've been thinking about maybe, because if we are 8 people and everyone is like a co-founder, then we can do like a yearly utdelning instead of like being employed. Is that even possible?
Honestly, I don't know a lot about that. But generally, I would not advise against doing stuff like that. Like most startups basically like employ themselves. So like Johannes and I, we are technically employees of the company.
And then it's still the same tax as a normal employee, even if you're
Yeah. But like later on, yes, like our mentor has talked about it. Like Johannes and I, we have a holding company, which is basically just a company that owns companies. So Johannes and I own a little company that owns part of Eat Great Sleep. So in the future, yes, we would could have like instead of paying us, we could just send the money to our other company.
Yeah.
But then again, you have to start a company like that costs 50,000. So like for the main business, you have to pay 50,000, and then just for your own company, you have to pay 50,000. And I mean, I think most people are not that well off, especially not millennials. And I say that as a millennial.
No, I didn't. I have one more for you, Martin, regarding the burn rate. And you mentioned Silicon Valley quickly before. And one thing that's quite popular these days is, thanks to the internet, going to places like, for example, Bali or Bangkok, which are very well connected, and then working with the team out from there in order to keep the burn rate low. What do you think of that in regards to game studios? Would that be possible for startups too, or would it be difficult due to copyrights and other things like that?
So if I understand you correctly, like using outsourcing from parts of the world who have lower working wages?
No, rather outsource ourselves by moving there to work and therefore keeping our own costs low instead of opening a studio, well, for example, here in Sweden, where, taxes, living costs, etc. are, incredibly high in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's one right answer there either. Like, what you get in Sweden would be like, especially as a citizen, would be a nice support system. So if the company would shut down, like then you would have like protection, which you might not have in other parts of the world. But if you're not a Swedish citizen, then that doesn't matter, perhaps. Like usually, like when we talk about outsourcing, it's like quality or quantity. And like in a country, and I'm not talking about, we're talking about China or?
I mean, any place, usually either Asia or Eastern Europe.
Yeah, so I don't want to be specific, but like usually like the general educational level, like so let's just take Sweden as an example. Like the educational level is fairly high, so you can expect that the workforce here is well educated. So that's like, but if you just mean like if the core team moves somewhere, then like honestly, I can't tell because I haven't done that journey. I would talk with someone who've done that. Like either way, like yes, you would. You could like pay yourself lower wages, but still like your company would still cost a lot of money. So like I think in the end, like there's probably as many, like if you really want to move to, let's say, China, and like as a for other reasons, but just for saving money, I think like in the long run, that's short-sighted. Because there's other like pros and cons with every place. So I mean, just like maybe there's like I mean, China is huge with investments now. So maybe like let's go to China. There's a lot of investors. Maybe that's a good argument. But maybe not like let's move to place X to save money. That in itself, I don't think it's a good enough reason. Yes. Ed, how much time can we run over?
It's on the ferry, so you
okay.
So there's no rush at all.
Yeah, me neither. I can be here a few minutes more. Yes? Yes.
Okay. Martin, thank you for a very interesting talk. I especially appreciate you pointing out the need for some sort of life also outside. And I also like that, you need to eat. It's called Eat, Create, Sleep. Just creating and sleeping is going to kill you eventually. Also, sleep is probably important there. Yeah. But as maybe a comment to the questions of both alternative ways of paying yourself or moving to other places in order to keep your burn rate lower, one of the reasons why places like Sweden are more expensive is because, and why it's also costs tax to have people employed like yourself, is because you do pay for some sort of security system. That can mean things like you pay for your possibility to have parental leave, you pay for your possibility to have sick leave, you pay for some sort of fund for your future when you're retiring, that if you move away from here and you're not considering these as real costs for you, then you are not calculating this correctly. And then we're not even talking about the question if you feel that maybe the fact that you have gotten a free education in a country like Sweden that has been paid for by others in their tax wouldn't be an interesting motivation for giving this possibility to the generations that come after you. So I think I would like to mention these points as well. Think about where you're going and what you can actually get by living in a place that offers these kind of possibilities. And many places maybe don't. And I would like to congratulate you or applaud you maybe more for staying here and doing this in this place, which I think is quite impressive. So thank you very much for your talk.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think just a comment back. I think part of like why I started here is basically like ideologically motivated, because I think there's a risk. Like I think like I went to Slush in 2016, and one of the speakers there, he said, "Yeah, we've made an app that informs you like which city you want to move to, because who cares about countries anymore?" And I think like right now, like this would be basically a Black Mirror episode. So I'm not saying this will come to pass, but like what I'm worried about is now like we concentrate all the wealth to a few cities. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to start. Like this is not like a sane business decision. But as I said, there are other sane business decisions to start here. But like one of the reasons we started Eat, Create, Sleep on Gotland was basically like a big finger to like the wealthy cities, like to have some kind of like show that you can actually make something for yourself outside of one of these like places of power, basically. So that's like my personal conviction, and like I realized that like I have nothing against Stockholm, for example. But yeah, so like, and as you said about like the taxes, like I have no problem paying taxes, and I would argue that I'm proud to do so, because as I said, all the things you get in return, like for example, like if an employee would be sick for a month or something, like more than a week, if an employee is sick for more than a week, then you can apply for Försäkringskassan to pay the wages for you. So then you don't have to worry about like, should I cut the employee? Because like as a startup, you can't really afford having a lot of the workforce not there, but you still have to pay for them. So that's one worry you don't have to think about. Yeah, as I said, there's a lot of boons being here, but of course you can start a company where the hell you want. Next question. Please wait for the microphone.
Well, I'm just curious, like, since you're a co-founder, and you have like small group people working for you, do you have a life, like how do you balance your life? You need to like working on the product, you need to working on the project you're trying to make, and you said like don't focus on one game, you need to make more. I think it's just said, because yeah.
So your question is how to balance work and life, right? Yeah. And like, should you make more than one game at once?
Yeah, and how?
Okay, so I think my point is, like, to answer the second part first, my point isn't really that you have to make more than one game at once, but rather that you focus on making a company that's like, you can make one game at a time, but it's more like, what kinds of games do we want to make? Like, okay, so we make this game now, what do we want to make the next? Like, usually like big companies, like who only have one development team, usually have like one game in production and then one in pre-production. So you have like an ongoing cycle. So we actually, like, we made a relaunch for Crest yesterday, but we actually have finished pre-production on our next game. So we worked spent a lot of time like thinking about work-life balance, and we actually nowadays we work 30 hours per week. Because studies have shown that like six-hour work days are more effective than 8, or like crunch. Let's just say it. Crunch is stupid. There was a talk about, as I said, I quoted that earlier GDC talk, and maybe I can link it later in the game group or something. But the psychologist said that the first 2 weeks of crunching gives positive effects, but after that it's worse than just working like fewer hours. So what we do is, like, we've actually done that since almost the beginning. Like, before we were really like, now we're kind of a stable company. We earn some money. We're not gone tomorrow. Famous last words. But like, honestly, like, one of the, I think, main reasons we haven't burned out is because we've been really adamant about having like short work weeks. Because you're not like, I don't know if this is like a theory established or not, but I think that, you know, the subconscious, it works all the time, like when you sleep, when you're not working. And I think that if you're faced with a problem, like let's say you're a programmer and you have a solution or a problem you want to solve, and like you just banging your head into it, and like like science have said that there seems to be like a substance in the brain that gets burned when you make decisions. So basically, like, when you worked X amount of hours per day, like that substance is like depleted. So it means that it's harder and harder to make decisions. But if you rest, like you replenish, and like usually my most brilliant ideas come like 9 o'clock in the evening, or like just before I eat breakfast or something. So I think you should like look at the game industry as like I usually say to my employees that like 3/4 of a problem is just figuring out the problem, and 1/4 is actually making the solution.
So is that like you have like a short meeting before you start working, like a brainstorm, or just communicate with the game you're making? So since you said the brilliant idea you made is like 9ish.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
And I think like the reason, like my point is like if you give your time to rest, then you will recharge and like have, because if you're working too much all the time, because I would argue that making games is it's a problem solving business. So it's not like maybe if you're out in the woods, chop wood for like 8 hours, maybe that's more productive than just doing it for 2 hours. But I mean, like, and I think we as humans generally think that if we apply ourselves in 8 hours chopping wood, then that's more effective. And we think that that's also like when programming or doing art or something, like, let's just do those 8 hours and then we will have like, but usually like it's like in those 8 hours, maybe just one of them were actually like the thing that's actually solved the problem. So like I think we have to have like like the feeling, like if we spend a lot of hours on something, then maybe that's just a feeling that we've done a lot of stuff. Like I think you have to be self-critical of like what have I actually accomplished, and I think then you will like realize that some like shorter days will perhaps improve your work.
Oh yeah, well, you force your programmer like go to take a break.
Yes.
Because they're like, and how? And because they're like sitting in front of the computer and looking so serious, and I'm afraid.
Yeah, like we have like each day we have like a fika break, and everyone is forced to fika.
Nice.
Yes.
Just have a chance to put up. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Just talk to him.
And also.